But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths again using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial...
The fact of the matter is that the U.S. grand strategy, if we can use that term of the grand strategists of the U.S. State, see our grand strategy in the United States as being dominance. And I often refer to an article that I think is very clear, succinct, and revealing by a former colleague of mine at Harvard University, Robert Blackwell, an esteemed ambassador of the United States, who wrote in 2015, and I'll quote from the article, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." Well, China doesn't want the United States to be the preeminent power. It wants to live alongside the United States. Blackwell, writing in 2015, said China's rise is a threat to U.S. preeminence. And he laid out a series of steps that the Biden administration actually is following almost step by step. What Blackwell laid out already back in 2015 is that the United States should create, quote, "new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China. There should be a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, a buildup of, quote, power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery, and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimland despite any Chinese opposition. This has become the Biden foreign policy. China knows it. China really is pushing back. But what's very important and interesting to understand, and we've seen it clearly in the dynamics involving the Ukraine war, most of the world also does not want the U.S. as the global preeminent power. Most of the world wants a multipolar world and is therefore not lined up behind the United States sanctions on Russia and so forth. And this was also the message of President Lula visiting China, saying to President Xi Jinping, we as Brazil also want multipolarity, true multipolarity, and we want peace, for example, in the Russian-Ukraine war that is based on not a U.S. perception of dominance, say NATO enlargement, but rather a peace that reflects a multipolar world. This is real. It's happening all over the world. And the fact of the matter is, the reason why this is a historic watershed is that the underlying economics and technological change have made it so the U.S. is no longer the dominant world economy. And the G7, which is the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, is actually smaller than the BRICS countries in economic size, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So we really are, in fact, in a multipolar world, but in ideology, we're in a conflict.
But Jeffrey Sachs, I wanted to ask about that. You mentioned the BRICS. The BRICS Bank that is now in China, and President Lula has named Dilma Rousseff as the head of the BRICS Bank. Its importance in terms of this multipolarity of in the world economies, the potential for even the creation of alternative major currencies to the dollar as a result of the BRICS alliance. The impact of that on world affairs.
This is a big deal. And in fact, the United States is withdrawing. It doesn't know it necessarily. Our politicians don't understand this, but our politicians are withdrawing from the world financial and monetary scene and opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things, because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi, we'll trade in rubles, we'll trade in rupees, we'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. The issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, you know, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent 5. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change, or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table.
Eu acho que essa guerra já passou da conta. O Brasil já fez a crítica que tinha que fazer.
I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying, and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200-kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli. And yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written.
Said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe one or two overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900-kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent, December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008, by God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it, because this is a game. The game is Nuland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know,
Okay?
I think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, you know, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, you know, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and
is
by the way,
biggest
if I may just,
proliferator of nuclear weapons.
if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back, and now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, yeah, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it, stop, don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this, NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon,
Jeffrey Sachs,
yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that BlackRock, representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. This is the first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you, I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the U.S. grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said
what happened to Western values, because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not an inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written The Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. It is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later, in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail, because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was, not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually, as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable, and she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese? Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can, but I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. and it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local.
Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The biggest lie is where this war came from. And
I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the U.S. rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. Do you get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts. But we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh, yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO. And the Iraq War was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally Assad with the CIA regime change operation. And oh yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border, and not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the U.S. Conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the U.S. government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then. It started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the U.S. poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing, because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story
since 2014, and really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the U.S. pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney-Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the U.S. government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and yeah, NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, and then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah.
It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, and they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me, but the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Well, let me just say the kinds of things that should be done, in my opinion, are things like the Belt and Road Initiative of China, because the Chinese government recognized that for China's own well-being, but also the well-being of its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, and countries even farther afield, all economies need modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure means access to high quality electricity, especially zero carbon energy now, to fast rail, to fiber, 5G networks, and so forth. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in its 10th year, uses especially finance from China, from the China Development Bank and other institutions, to help finance the spread of infrastructure across Eurasia and across the sea routes, also connecting Africa and South America and East Asia. So that's a very good example. It's pragmatic, it's investment oriented, it doesn't just talk the talk, it actually provides the financing and provides the technology. I wish the rich countries in the West were doing this. They are the former colonial powers.
They behaved badly when they were the colonial powers, and they're not behaving very well as the post-colonial powers. They're not really stepping up to their responsibility.
Right, because I was just in China like for 2 months, and I think it really strengthens the weaknesses of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of promoting this ideology of carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. But at the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation which is mainly centered on the energy transformation, and it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There is no national plan. It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in 2 coal companies. So I regard that as corruption, but in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. And one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money-based, money-focused, that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get.
That's always exactly right.
Yeah,
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right. It's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this, is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. And it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. And it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, you know, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses, but for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question, because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out-of-date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the US system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the US is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
So, excellent point. Basically,
There are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States. Because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually.
Yeah.
And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University, working together, discussing, and so forth. Somehow making such projects, both economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low-cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.